honking horns, banging pans, singing, and marching with the three-finger salute, which stands for the Myanmaris for restoration of their democracy. They are clearly sending a message to the military dictators to back down. Myanmar has seen a series of protests ever since the military drove out the civilian leader Aung San Suu Kyi and her party, National League for Democracy, from power. Several protesters were killed in the city's garment production hub. Several Chinese finance factories are suffering arson attacks. Security forces have used tear gas, rubber bullets and live rounds against the protesters in daily crackdown across the country. The UN data reveals that since February 1st, Myanmar military killed approximately 138 protesters. The United Nations fears that Myanmar is committing crimes against humanity. After Sunday's violence, despite the UN's criticism and appeal to stop violence, Myanmar's military has extended martial law in 6 townships. Anyone arrested in the areas put under martial law will have to face trials under a military tribunal. If a person is found guilty, they'll be sentenced for a period of 3 years. Fearing reprisals, 380 people have fled from Myanmar to Mizoram, India. These people claim that they belong to the police force and the fire service of Myanmar. The Indian government is providing relief to these Myanmar nationals on humanitarian ground. The UN chief has called for the international community, including regional countries, to come together in solidarity with the people of Myanmar and their democratic aspirations. The global community needs to help protect the Myanmar citizens amid the crackdown. The fight for the lives of people can only be won by combating and countering acts of violence, and most importantly, by providing justice to the lives lost due to human rights violations. There is a need to ramp up pressure on Myanmar's military. Only then the country will be able to restore democracy. Bureau Report, Democracy News Live, New Delhi. Good evening, I'm Rohit Gandhi. Today, we are focusing on the recent happenings in Myanmar. Myanmar is back to where it started in the year 1949. The military took over the country and established a dictatorship. The reason they took over in 1949 was because they said that General Aung San was incapable of handling the unification of the nation. Now, in 2021, they're clearly worried that their role will be diminished, the military's role will be diminished because of the reforms in the constitution. National League of Democracy, the NLD party, tried this before, but due to 25% of military's hold in parliament, they failed the military. You have to remember, NLD is led by Aung San Suu Kyi, again General Aung San's daughter. The military has said that it will be in power for 1 year. But as we know that these are just words, and no military dictatorship has given up power that easily. Even if you looked at General Musharraf in the year 2000, he said he's going to be here only for a year, but that's exactly what happened. So the protesters in Myanmar are not giving up. Activists have started civil disobedience movement. On the government end, they're ramping up the pressure as well. The internet is being shut down and people are being arrested. Many are calling upon international agencies to intervene and reinstate the democracy. While all have condemned the military takeover, nobody seems to offer tangible solutions. And that's why we are here today discussing it. There are too many sensitivities. China and India are right next door to Myanmar. Any US presence would create a larger international issue. Joining us to discuss the military coup and the challenges around it are Nay San Lwin. He's a Rohingya activist and blogger. He's based in Germany. Dan Slater is the director of Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies. He's based in Michigan. And Heather Connor is a human rights and environmental and community activist. Rory Mangovan is the chief of Asia Pacific region at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. First, welcome you all to the show. Let me start with Nay San. Explain to me what's going on here. Why does the military keep coming back and keep taking power?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me in this panel. Uh, so this is the third time military coup in 59 years since 1962. The first coup in 1962 lasted 26 years, and then in 1988 it lasted 23 years. So in the past 10 years, so-called this democratic government, two government. One was the quasi-civilian government. The last one is the civilian government led by the Aung San Suu Kyi. But all of you know that this all are under 2008 constitution created by the military. Military hold the 25% seat in the parliament. So uh, it was not the real democracy we have. So now what we are trying is to not to restore the democracy, but to get the real democracy that will be for everyone, human rights for all, justice for all, and equality for all. So, in the last February 1st, the military took over the power and detained this civilian leader, all the political figure, and the activists, journalists, and the member of the civil society. So as
Sure.
of now, the military is committing the crime against humanity. The media and the UN officers reporting about the 138 dead, but in reality, the death toll is much higher than the media reporting. Only in the line
Sure.
tire, the
Sure.
in one town alone, there are about 250 in 3
Sure.
days.
Nay,
So
Nay,
it is clear that
let me bring in Rory here. Rory, if you can weigh in, what's really happening here? Uh, Human rights, or as a lot of the protesters and a lot of the activists are saying, are being violated. Well, how come the world just looks on, passes a statement, and that's the end of it? Why isn't there more action? Is it even possible for the world to react and do something?
Yeah. Thank you for having me, Rohit. And perhaps just before responding, just to confirm, what the colleagues have been saying about, the level of violence that we are now seeing in response to the protest movement. You cited some figures we had as of earlier in the week, but as of today, we are now recording more than 200 deaths of protesters, more than 2,000 people who have been detained since the 1st of February. And when I see the list of information each day, and you look at these cases, the cause of death, headshot, shot to the abdomen. These are not isolated instances of force being used by security forces. We are beginning to see the pattern of a very systematic targeting of protesters with lethal force. What can be done? Well, of course, Myanmar has always been very high already on the UN agenda, in the Security Council, in the Human Rights Council, in all of these intergovernmental bodies. We've had a variety of different mechanisms, to address the military rule in the past, the Rohingya crisis in most recent years. Myanmar has found itself being taken to the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court. And so it is very frustrating, I think, for people to look for the impact, look for the the thing that will make the difference on the ground. And
Sure.
here, I think the answers do have to come from within Myanmar. They do have to come from these forces within the society. They do have to come from the other actors, the trade union movement, the business community in Myanmar, the religious leaders in Myanmar. And I think our role as an international community is to create an environment that gives them maximum support, maximum leverage, maximum position to try and take forward a more fundamental change in the country.
Sure. Sure. Rory, I've been inside Myanmar. I went in with the Chin rebels almost over a decade ago. And I've seen the kind of military power, the military holds, the kind of pressure they can put in. And we've seen across democracies or dictatorships for that matter. When dictatorships take over these democracies, it's very difficult for the civilians to stand up and fight. It's not an easy fight. Let me bring in Heather O'Connor here. Heather, you're a human rights activist. Explain to me, when you look at a challenge such as the one we're seeing in Myanmar right now, do you think there is a role for the larger global community and the human rights community to weigh in and do something about it?
Absolutely. I think I agree with Rory that international support has to come multilaterally, and we have to support people on the ground right now somehow, which is very difficult with humanitarian aid. And I think that's the number one objective right now. I come from a community in Buffalo, New York, where there are 25 to 30,000 Burmese former refugees that are now U.S. residents and citizens, and they are frantic about, they have sent aid to their friends and families for years, and now they are frantic about how to support the protest movement. But that the banks, the means of getting aid that they normally use are off, and so that's a big frustration right now. And I think that's a number one problem to solve. And there are groups that are working on that, which I think they're doing underground in as many ways as they possibly can. So that's what I'm working on. I'm also calling on my representatives in the U.S. We're kind of back in the game diplomatically, finally. And I'm hopeful that the U.S., and they have been, cutting off financial ties to the junta, the military junta, which is, I think, a really important first step. And so the other thing is, I think that the U.S. needs to keep focused on these diplomatic channels and work that's the number one thing I push for, is to work multilaterally, internationally.
Absolutely. I take your point, and the US has a role to play in the international world and certainly is capable of weighing in and putting pressure on the junta in Burma. Let me bring in Dan Slater here. Dan, you work on democracies and developing democracies out of the University of Michigan. Explain to me, when you look at Myanmar still stuck at the same place where they were in 1949 and keeps going back to that same starting point, is it possible for this nation to come out of its hangover of constantly being back in the dictatorship basket?
I think if you look around the world, there's all kinds of reasons to think that Myanmar can escape that cycle. Actually, military regimes are quite rare in the world. And so in most instances, militaries find ways to defend their own interests and kind of find their interests met, not being in direct power, but essentially, sharing power with civilians. And for the past 10 years, what we've seen in Myanmar is a kind of power sharing relationship where civilians and military were, both, essentially shared the state, shared authority over politics. And this was a process that the military itself had set up. And clearly there are forces within the military who preferred and, even led the way in forging that kind of arrangement. And so I think it's certainly not implausible to think that there could be forces within the military and factions within the military who could hopefully stand down from and reverse this incredibly self-defeating coup, which doesn't have support anywhere outside of the narrow ranks of the military.
Right. Nay, let me bring you in here. You are a Rohingya activist. Now, when Aung San was in power, which means the party, which is now obviously being detained, and Aung San who's been detained, when she was in power, Rohingyas were still being persecuted. Was it being persecuted by the government itself, or was it the military even then, the military, the junta as it's described?
Yeah, let me tell you about my great-grandfather. In 1947, when Aung San established the Constituent Assembly member, my brother of my great-grandfather was a constituent assembly member with him. So after the independence of Burma in 1948, Rohingya were recognized as an official indigenous ethnic group, and also we had the full citizenship. But those were taken away by the this military regime in the early 1970s, and in 1978, the same military regime launched a massive violence against Rohingya known as a Dragon King operation. As a result, 270,000 had to flee to Bangladesh, and later they were repatriated. So this kind of violence repeated again and again in 1991, in 2012, and 2016, and the last wave of the violence was in 2017. Now more than 1 million Rohingya are in Bangladesh, but this Rohingya genocide was I mean, the most responsible for the Rohingya genocide is the military, not the government. But the government follow the military policy and endorse, as all of you know that Aung San Suu Kyi went to the International Court of Justice. I was in the same courtroom, she defended the military and dismissed the genocide. But now in the country, since after this first February coup, the situation has been changed. Most of the people understood that the Rohingya genocide was real because they all believed that, since Aung San Suu Kyi was the military side, they all believed the military propaganda. They thought, it was really, the fault by the Rohingya. They are the illegal immigrants. But now the people are changing slowly. They are accepting the Rohingya genocide. So I think in a few weeks we will see the clear picture. They have realized, endorsing taking military side is completely wrong, and hopefully we can build a better future, and all the ethnic minority in the country, including the Rohingya, will be in the new democracy process.
Absolutely. And one of the disappointing things that people saw after Aung San came to power is she fell in line with the military. And a lot of people were very disappointed on what she could have possibly delivered, stood up, and she didn't deliver. And I think that became a big challenge area. Rory, may I ask you to weigh in on this? Aung San went and defended the military when it came down to the genocide of the Rohingyas, and certainly the rest of the world has spoken about it. There are hundreds and thousands of Rohingyas, and like the gentleman said, about 1 million Rohingyas out there, many in India, Bangladesh, and all of these other places. Did this approach by Aung San weaken her position, and a position of military got even more strength to take power again?
Yeah, look, it's a very tragic irony of the whole history here. And, I think it points back to this fundamental problem at the heart of Myanmar's transition, which is why, the country is stuck, as you suggested in your opening, Rohit, and that is the lack of accountability of the military to the civilian authority. This is the big difference that between democracy and military rule, and the fact that military stranglehold over the politics of the country was never broken in this transition. That moment in 2017-18, the Rohingya crisis, perhaps was a moment where she could have leveraged the international community. She could have leveraged the ICC and the ICJ cases and so forth to weaken the military. And I think that perhaps in retrospect was, a missed opportunity. But I think now we have to, we have to look forward. It's not about her; it's about the institutions. And I agree very much with, with what my Bangladesh friend has said. When the protest movement began, the first demand was restore democracy, release the leaders, and so forth. Now, if you listen to the protest movement, it's, rewrite the constitution. It's unified people across ethnic groups to sort of recognize some new kind of national identity. So, my hope in this situation is that from this, if we can find a pathway forward, that some of these fundamental problems that were there before can be addressed. Some of these root causes can be, tackled. And as the Bangladesh friend said, Rohingya friend said, to really build back a better future for Myanmar.
Sure. Dan, if I can bring you in here, rewriting the constitution for countries could be a very, very long process. How can democracy be reinstated? What are the first steps that may be required to reinstate the situation of a democracy?
Well, the good possibility that we have in Myanmar is that the country was already on a track toward deeper democratization. This was a substantial liberalization of the country over the past decade. Again, it was a constitution that the military wrote, that the military was completely invested in. And as a result, they've just sort of, burned up their entire process in a way that is, again, like I said, very self-defeating. It's not good for the military. It's clearly not good for the society of Myanmar. It's not something that any of Myanmar's neighbors want to see. Nobody wants to see this kind of instability. This is not something that China has welcomed. China worked quite well with the civilian part of the government in Myanmar before. And so, as Rory was saying, the military, I think, they might have seen this as a show of strength. And I think they imagined that within a year or two, they could return to some kind of power sharing, but with the military in a much stronger position after this, coup as a show of strength, not unlike what we see in Thailand next door. But in reality, it's just blown up in their faces. And what we see is that it's not just that they could even return to the status quo ante. They've, at this point, they're raising demands, people willing to die, and go on general strike for much deeper reforms, exactly the kind of reforms that really would reduce the military's power. And the whole reason they put this constitution, and spent really, 3 decades putting this constitution in place to make this happen. So it's very, very difficult to see a way forward for the military unless they really reverse course in a dramatic fundamental.
Sure. Heather, if I can bring you in here, what is the community in your region saying? What do they need done right away? And how can the global community weigh in beyond the United States?
I think that we are asking our government, the U.S. government, to take action with stronger sanctions, stronger international intervention, and for the responsibility to protect, to enforce that in the UN. That's a big deal right now. And that is, was established in 2005 to get the whole international community involved in condemning acts of genocide. So I think that's important. I think there's a lot of different voices in my community. We have a large different ethnicities among our Burmese community too. There's a large Karen population here, and they support the Karen army. But the Karen army is also supporting the civil disobedience movement within Myanmar. And this is what I see as being very hopeful, is that people are uniting in a way that's never happened before. So this is very interesting to me too. But in terms of targeting our representatives here in the U.S., we're asking for stronger sanctions, cut off the money, and work with other nations to put pressure.
All right. Thank you very much, Heather. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Nay. And thank you, Rory, for joining me for this discussion. If you look at Myanmar, it's no easy nation at many, many levels. There are many communities, whether it's the Chin, whether it's the Kachin, whether they're the Karens, they're all looking for making sure that they have equal rights within that constitution. They have a place within Myanmar. They have a say within Myanmar, and some of them want, to exercise their own rights within that country. So, not an easy task at hand, but the military is not a solution for anything. It never was, it never is, and never will be. What possibly is the only thing that will sustain is democracy. Thanks for watching. Good night and good luck.